just out today. It's called The Return of George Washington, 1783 to 1789. And the author is Edward Larson. He's a winner of a Pulitzer Prize for History. Edward Larson, welcome to Big 550 KTRS.
Thank you. Great to be here, especially on a day after the Cards won.
Yeah. Are you a Cardinal fan?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
As a kid, I grew up watching Gibson.
Okay. You're not
My favorite pitcher.
You're not saying that because you are on the radio here in St. Louis and you're on a book tour. And
no, I honestly am a Cards fan.
Okay, good.
I grew up in Southern Ohio. I love the Reds, but whenever the Gibson would come in, I'd always go over and watch him.
There you go. Well, there was a good one to watch. So let's talk about this new book you got, The Return of George Washington. A lot of people know that George Washington was the commander of the Continental Army. Many people know that he was the first president of the United States. But what they don't tell you in history class is what happened in between. And you found a nugget of history, a sliver of history that has gone untouched.
Washington's a great story, and people do know those parts. You're absolutely right. And I don't know why they don't know the part in between, because that's where he puts it all together. It was a privilege to be able to look at it. I mean, he took a country. When he retired as general of the army, he was the most famous person in the world. He had led this continental. He created a continental army, a bunch of colonies that weren't even connected, and he led them to victory over the greatest power in the world. And for that, he was literally known throughout Europe, throughout the Americas. And he'd retired because he did not covet power himself. He was a believer in Republican virtue. He'd already accomplished everything he could. He had a great plantation. He went back to that in Virginia. But he remained committed to being an American. And when he saw this whole experiment collapsing as the states all pulled apart, there was no effective central government, he was committed to creating. He viewed this as an experiment of popular rule. The rest of the world still had monarchies, dictatorships. There was no government of the people, as he put it. And he saw a need to come back out. That's the return. During this period, as he begins to communicate with his friends, with the people he'd gotten to know throughout the country, as a military leader, going back and forth with his former officers, with the governors around the country, he pulls them together, leading to the the first Congress where they would draft a constitution, the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, and then through the ratification debates, he came to see a stronger government was needed, and he ended up leading it again, though, at the end of it, retiring again back to his plantation where he really was the happiest back there.
It's really interesting because we all know 1776, right? That's the day the Declaration of Independence was signed. And we do know that that's when sort of the war started, right? Most of the fighting happened after that. And then we know about the Constitution, which was, in the 1880s, right? But in those years, why is it those years never taught about the struggle between the end of the war and the start of the country?
It's a simple story to focus on the Revolutionary War. And because of the time period, we telescope together the creation of the current government, the Constitution. But that was, as you say, it wasn't finished until 1789. There's quite a period in there. And, you look around the world and we see all these countries. They have revolutions, and then they descend into chaos. We think of Libya today or wherever. America was going through that period. Oh, maybe not quite that bad, but Washington had stepped down. The war was over. We were independent. There wasn't any direction for the overall country. And Washington believed that to be a great country, for the self-interest of all individuals in the whole, to build up an economy, to have prosperity at home, to take the frontier, to have respect abroad, we needed to pull together as a single nation. It was that vision. Now, of course, people don't go to that. There was no experience. There was no other no other country had ever done this, and we had to learn our way. And it was a fitful process. It was fitful for Washington. He tried to figure out this approach and that approach. Other people were involved, and this period, it was such a dynamic period, but it's a confusing period, and it's not a simple story.
Yeah.
As these pieces get brought together, and we forge a new government. It's a story that though resonates today as we look around the world and we try to see countries, some of them successful, some unsuccessful, moving to make a better, more democratic state in their own countries. We went through that process too, and if we understand what we did and how a few great leaders plus a principle of civilian rule and popular rule, how those principles, the principles of a market economy, those ideas were essential to creating our republic. Maybe we can help learn how the difficulties the rest of the world is facing and what they need to get through this period.
The book is called The Return of George Washington, 1783 through 1789. Edward Larson, our guest. How hard did they lobby Washington to come back? Jefferson and Adams and the rest of them. How hard was it to get them to leave Mount Vernon and to go to Philadelphia?
Washington did not want to leave Mount Vernon. If you've ever been there, it's a beautiful place. It's a wonderful plantation. It had suffered greatly during the war, during his absence, and for his own economic well-being, he needed to put it back together. And he was a great farmer. He was a very, very sort of a scientific farmer, a lot of new ideas. He was always an idea person. He was always involved. He loved to, every day he would go out to all of his farms and oversee the work. He'd pick the crops, and he just really loved doing that. But he had become an American. He first and foremost American. He had a sense of public purpose, and so they would write him letters. They would say, look, this whole experiment is falling apart. These states are scattering. Vermont is talking about joining British Canada. The British troops haven't left the frontier. The frontier's people are on as a pivot, as he said, and ready to go off and join the Spanish or the French. The whole system's collapsing. In Rhode Island, they started printing paper money like crazy up there and disregarding property rights. There was revolution in Massachusetts. We need a strong hand. You're the only person who has the nation's respect. And they wrote him, they called him, and he didn't know if it was yet time. He said, it's all going crazy. What can be done? And he had to have an idea. They gave him ideas. He thought about it. He thought about other options. He worked together with these people first behind the scenes. But he realized that his capital could be wasted if he came out and it didn't work. So he had to be fairly confident that he'd laid the foundation. He was a practical, experienced politician. You can't lead a revolution without learning how to also lead a country.
Yeah, the book.
And then he grudgingly came out of retirement when he thought there was no other option.
How did you go about telling this story? Where did you go to find the information?
I spent the past year at Mount Vernon. I was the first library fellow. There's a new library at Mount Vernon, the Library for the Study of George Washington, and I had the good fortune to be their first inaugural fellow. Was able to live right at Mount Vernon. What a treat that was to be able to get them up in the morning and walk around along the banks of the Potomac. And I was able to use the materials there. There are also a vast array of published materials because the people corresponding with him live different places. Their archives are different places. There's also a tremendous repository of early American newspapers kept by the American Antiquarian Society. Put them all together, you're able to look at his correspondence, look at what the people were saying, look at what other leaders were saying, look at what was happening in each of the states. And then with the Constitutional Convention itself, we have the notes of the Constitutional Convention that were kept by James Madison. There were other letters and commentary about what was happening, piecing all those pieces together. And then, of course, the most fun for me as Washington in the middle of the process made this made this trip west. He had already retired, and of course, as a young man, he'd surveyed in the frontier. He knew the frontier well, and he went west into the Ohio Valley, following buffalo trails, and that's when he saw how tenuous the America's hold was on the frontier. And as all Americans believed that America's future lay on the frontier, it was only because we could move west to the Mississippi and then beyond into the area where St. Louis is. Only by adding that territory, that's where people saw their future. He was connected with that, with his own frontier land holdings. He knew the common people needed to have an opening. That was our economic future. And when he traveled out there, he realized how tenuous America's hold was. That further convinced him that we needed a strong union that could defend the Northwest Territory, to move west and create economic opportunity, a national market economy for the American people.
Edward Larson, you're a winner of a Pulitzer Prize for History. How much of this story did you know before you became the librarian for the library? And did you drop a box and all of a sudden discover this treasure trove, or did you go there knowing that this is what you wanted to do?
Oh, that's a great question. It's a little bit of both. I knew the story of what had happened because I teach that part of American history, and I knew that there was this really confused period between the Revolution and the Constitution. That there was this 5-year period when the Articles of Confederation, when the Confederation was collapsing, as it were. So I knew that story, but nobody had really followed Washington's role. They talk about other people's. The people tend to view James Madison as the architect of the Constitution. Well, if James Madison was the architect of the Constitution, then Washington was its general contractor, the person who got it done. And so I wanted to see, what was Washington doing during this period? We tend to view him as a wax figure, or that up on Mount Rushmore, he's the solid face. We look at him on the $1 bill. I knew he was a dynamic person. I knew he liked people. I knew he was a conversationalist. I knew he was very involved from having studied him during the Revolution and as president. So what about this period? What was he doing? So I didn't know. I knew the country was changing during this period. I knew both before and after Washington was the leader. What was he doing this period? I went to find out what Washington was doing, and by looking at that, I got to see that he was a main actor during this period. We remember him as first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen. Well, the war was the Revolution. This was the peace. This is when he was also the first American.
If he retires after the war, and he is so reluctant to come back, and then he creates and helps create the Constitution, then they sweet talk him to become president for 8 years?
Well, he knew when he came forward to work with the Constitution, he knew that he'd have to be the first leader. Oh, he might have said he didn't want it, but in his heart of hearts, he knew that coming back from Mount Vernon, he would not only have to work getting the Constitution written and see if that could pull off, he'd have to work for ratification and pull off ratification. If it could be ratified and go into effect, that he would have to be his first leader. He never thought he'd have to stay for 8 years, though. He thought he could go, get it going, and then leave. It just took. There were problems in Europe. Right. There was added confusion. But still, even then, people wanted him to serve even longer. Right. They wanted him to serve a third term. And he says, no, this is enough. I'm going home.
The book is The Return of George Washington. Edward Larson, our guest. Last question for you, George. When I go to New York, there's that, is it Francus Tavern? What's the name of that tavern?
Francus Tavern. That is a great place. Yeah, I'm glad you've been there. It's right down there on the tip. That's where he had his farewell dinner with his troops after they'd liberated New York City, the last act of the war. The British had hung on in New York. He liberated New York, had his great final banquet there. That was the finest tavern at the time. It's still a good one.
Right.
Finest tavern in New York City. When he came back as president, that was the first capital, and he recruited the chef of Francus Tavern, Sam, to be his cook at the executive mansion. So that's how good a place it was. But it's a great place. It's right down there at near the tip off Wall Street.
Right, yeah, it's right in the shadow of the new World Trade Center building, that Freedom Tower right there. It's a stone's throw, and it's a great tavern, and it's a working restaurant and bar now.
And you can go upstairs to where in a museum, they could be sort of as a museum, though you can actually book it for a meal. Upstairs where he had his final meal with the troops. I recommend for anyone, go to that wonderful new World Trade Center, the fountains there, and then walk on over to Fraunces Tavern for lunch.
Yeah, it's a great deal. The book is The Return of George Washington, 1783 to 1789. Winner of the Pulitzer Prize for History, Edward Larson. Edward, good luck with the book. I know it's a busy launch. Thanks for coming here on the first day. Good luck.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
9:27 here on the Big 550.